Good afternoon and welcome to this Lancashire Foundation's event within the framework of the World Conference on Higher Education, which is being held by UNESCO here in Barcelona. My name is Emilia Gorbe and I'm the director of the scholarships program here at the Lancashire Foundation. Thank you so much for your presence here. This is a hybrid event. It's both in person and online. And more than 100 people have registered who wanted to follow this event on streaming. So greetings to all of the people who are following us on the other side of the screen. This afternoon we want to think about a significant topic which plays a significant role in the molding of today's society: equality in accessing education. At the Lancashire Foundation for more than 40 years we've been betting on excellence through a scholarship program to study abroad, PhD studies and studies in Spain and Portugal. We launched a new scholarship program 1 year ago for a university degree in Spain addressed to excellent boys and girls, brilliant people who have few resources, in order to promote equality of opportunities in accessing higher education, which is what the UNESCO Congress is actually debating. At the Lancashire Foundation, we're convinced that talent is everywhere, and we only need the right tools to promote it. And to use deeply these tools and the needs and the context of this inequality is the first step to overcome it. That's why we have experts in this field, and I'd like to thank them for their presence here. Jorge Calero, Avnado Martinez, Elena Trujano, with David Francesc, who will be acting as a moderator in this debate, and who will later introduce the panel members in greater detail. This will provide us a lot of information about what is at stake, what's important, and what we can do to promote equality in accessing higher education studies. That's it. I'm going to give the floor to the panel members. Remember that at the end of the presentations there will be time for Q&A, because people who are following this event on streaming will be able to ask any questions they may want through the chat box. So once again, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for making this event possible. Thank you, Emilia. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome. As Emilia has just mentioned, we will be dealing with inequality in accessing higher education within the framework of the World UNESCO Conference, in which we will be approaching issues that affect in depth our education system. And for that, we have people who are highly qualified to discuss this. Equity or equality in education. This is at the very center of the public debate, and we could say it is one of the main concerns that governments have. And let me say that we should not actually talk about equality and quality, as has happened in some cases. Now, maybe people have highlighted that everybody, or as many people as possible, should study, which has been actually attained in part. There has been a clear reduction in the early dropout rate, but we should also take care of the excellence policies. An education system, and I'm sure this will be explained better than I by our panel members, this should frame from the very onset this panel members' discussion when it's able to tackle social and economic inequalities, to offer equality of opportunities, and to guarantee the academic excellence due to the effort and the capacity, regardless of the social, economic, and family context you come from. But inequality implies diversity, and therefore it is not necessarily something negative, as long as it is explained due to capability or interest levels. Inequality occurs when social and economic differences are the causes of that diversity. So this is the reason why equality and choosing an education center is part of the same discussion. We should avoid having the appearance of this, in the sense that choice should not be excluding, and it should promote equality. But there is a good piece of news within this framework that I have just defined. And then the experts will be developing it. Compared to other countries, the impact of your social and economic background is low. That's why we are the most equitable country in the OCDE. Fine, having said that, and to approach all of these issues, we have here with us Jorge Calera on my right-hand side, Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Barcelona. Jorge is a specialist in the economics of education and the analysis of public policies. Good afternoon, Jorge, and welcome. Thank you for being here. Then it's Aya Martinez, who comes from the States. She's an architect and she's a philologist. She has actually taught in high school and she has participated in many projects. Thanks to a postgraduate degree scholarship from La Caixa, she has actually studied at Harvard, where she is actually doing her PhD. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us. And thirdly, Elena Trujano. She's a sociologist. She is a professor and a researcher at the Research Group in Education and Work at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And she's a specialist in the sociology of higher education. So we have here three very different profiles, but they complement each other with regards to the issue of inequality and accessing higher education. In one first block, we will approach the main principles of education inequality. And we could start out from the starting point. What do you understand by higher education inequality? This is something that's defined maybe in a succinct way, but then when it comes to discussing it and to know how to approach it, we need to define how an early school dropout actually affects. Why is it important? Equality in accessing higher education. And then in this block, he will give us his perspective about the issue. Jorge, whenever you want, you have the floor. Thank you. Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I wanted to make a short introduction based on 5 main driving ideas about educational inequality. 5 ideas that are very much supported and backed by empirical evidence. What do we know about educational inequality? Much more than a few decades ago. But so to speak, well, let me give you a summary of 5 basic ideas about educational inequality to open up the discussion. So we have the following 5 points. First, educational inequalities, we know that they start early. They start very early indeed, with the first socialization in the family. They start with the first contact with the education system, usually during the first cycle of grammar studies, with the difference between the schooling in the educational system and what the family brings in. We know it starts early, and one of the most efficient interventions to favor educational equality should also start early. For example, we have the educational actions undertaken in the early schooling. We have some examples during the 70s in preschool, an experiment with a number of children, boys and girls, some of whom participated in early education programs, and they have been followed up throughout those years till now. Therefore, inequalities that start early. Secondly, inequalities that are cumulative. What does that mean? That means that inequalities by themselves do not improve, but actually they get worse. And the education system multiplies and includes inequality over inequality. And usually this actually ends up an early dropout of the school system. Third element, third idea that we should bear in mind. There is an equality field that is produced by different dimensions of inequality. Inequality from a social class point of view, from a gender point of view, from a genetic capital point of view, from the household incomes point of view, or a disability point of view. Well, these inequalities, these different fields, they cross each other. And one of these crossover are particularly important for inequality. For example, a specific ethnic origin, if you're high class, does not generate a problem. But the same ethnic origin in a low-income household or with serious economic problems would be much more of a problem. So we have this overlap of two inequalities. And we have to see the same applies with children with some sort of a disability. Sometimes households with good resources, high class families have enough resources, they have a lot of information, and they help the child with a disability. The same disability amongst low-income families produces a bigger problem. The fourth idea, inequalities, purely financial inequalities, are not the most difficult ones. There are inequalities related to the family's cultural capital, and there is the financial capital of the household. The household's income is relatively unimportant. But when we have the possibility to break down and segregate different factors, we find that purely financial factors are not the most important ones, or the ones with the greatest impact. And finally, inequalities. That's my fifth and last point. Inequalities affect very much the lives of people. And educational inequalities have a great effect on people's lives. Educational inequalities condition and determine your life in a very significant way. Accessing the labor market, or the setting up of a family, relationships, health, the education system, belonging to the education system, and I'm talking here about a global education, it contributes a lot of positive externalities. And one of these positive externalities, and this is one that interests me the most, because I believe it's the most significant one, is the one related to health. Education generates a lot of information and a lot of capability to have a healthier life and a greater life expectancy, a better life, so to speak. So, an education that allows you to have that conditions very much the lives of people. It's very important from an individual's point of view, and above all, from the point of view of the public policies, and from a social point of view, it's something that we have to take a lot of care of. Thank you. Thank you, Jorge. And next, Elena will talk about how inequalities affect the access of higher education. Transitioning towards university, Yes, thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I'm very, very happy indeed that an economist finally says that financial resources are not the most important factor. This is a great conquest, but I have to say that financial resources are important. Okay, with regards to inequalities, in the same way Jorge has focused on inequalities inequalities that are due to different resources. And they occur, above all, throughout a person's life. But the key point here is an early intervention. So what I'm going to do is add another type of inequality that also affects educational achievement, the sort of inequality that happens during the transition, what we call a transition period, each one of the crossroads in the education system, of the post-compulsory stages, the moment a person needs to decide whether they keep on studying or whether they just leave the education system. And if they want to follow an academic training or vocational training, in most countries in which there is this division, the academic road is the one with the greatest prestige. In some countries, there isn't that much difference between others. But in general, there is always a bit more prestige in the academic career. Here we find the next block of inequalities, because we know that indeed the social origin also influences the decisions that are made. And it influences even, and we see this, in the very fact that two young people with the same educational performance, when it comes to decide to make a decision in each one of these crossroads, depending on their social origin, they choose one way or the other. So that's another point in which that we study. And we study what happens, and we try and find out why does this inequality occur at these crossroad points. And at least in my research group, but in many other groups, what we do is to take a risk perspective, i.e., the idea that an educational choice implies a risk compared to its other options, so that what would be a specific transition towards the university is specified and materializes in what we could call the forecast to face any problem that you may encounter, i.e., risk-taking or risk sourcing. What sort of risk should or can a university student face? Well, academic pressure, when he or she starts studying. In our country specifically, an academic failure is related to an economic failure because the person may lose a scholarship. I mean, if you have a low academic performance, you may lose your scholarship. Or even if you do not lose your scholarship because maybe you do not even have a scholarship, automatically the cost of tuition goes up. The cost of a second tuition goes up. So the academic risk is also an economic and financial risk because not only it takes longer for you to finish your studies, but it's also a financial risk. But there are other types of risks as well. For example, there is also the risk of thinking that, well, you will like your studies, but maybe you do not like, the studies do not meet your expectations. This is a risk that you run when you choose a specific career at university. And it's a risk you should take because then, well, you find yourself with the idea, okay, may I change careers? May I not change? What will I do with my future? Another type of risk, which is even more distant, is, okay, you do not study what you like. You wanted to study Aramaic language studies, but then you can't find a job. Some studies have an easier access to the labor market and others have a worse access to the labor market. These sort of risks can be overcome. You have a greater capacity to face these risks in some families compared to others. Let me give you a few examples. If there are academic risks, you can hire private teachers. If the career takes longer, no problem. You can plan a change of studies, for example. Many middle-class families tell their children, listen, no problem. If you do not like what you're studying, no problem. You will have lost 1 year, but you can try another career. But this, in a working-class family, it's not that clear you can do it. I mean, you have one first opportunity, but maybe not a second opportunity, because people do not feel legitimate to waste any further time and all of the things that have been invested and carry out a change, for example. Or the labor insertion risks are greater to overcome in certain families as opposed to in other families. You can actually invest in supplementary training, or if you have to wait to get a better job, you just wait, no problem. But it will all depend on the household's resources. And some of the risks are easier to face in some families as opposed to in others. And therefore, it is not surprising that certain students, given the choice about continuing their studies or not, they actually make a decision based on the risk they have to take. Thank you. So next, Flavia will give us the perspective of students and how they experience this inequality now that we have seen the problem of educational inequality and how transitions between different education stages affect people's lives, especially those who come from low-income family backgrounds. So now it is your turn to give us the student's perspective. Thank you. Okay, the key is that not all students start from the same starting point for all of the different reasons that have been mentioned here. And therefore, not all of them have the same academic progress and not all of them have the same opportunities to access higher education. There is something important to bear in mind, and it's the fact that oftentimes these inequalities are not only experienced individually, but also in the context of schools. Different schools have a different ratio of students who have an unequal background from a social point of view. And we need to bear in mind other contexts experienced by these students. Oftentimes, both their social and family contexts, their family members, their friends, I mean, the expectations they have with regards to their studies, with regards to making headway and keep on studying, to go beyond the compulsory training, to do the baccalaureate. I mean, all of these decisions are marked by the context in which they live. And in my experience as a teacher in a school with low-income students, the idea that what is expected from them is not necessarily to go to university. Well, at the end of the day, this is an idea that roots up internally. And in the Spanish case, repeating an academic year has a significant effect. In lower income backgrounds, we have higher levels of repetition. And even if we compare students with the same academic capability, with the same academic skills, if we compare one of these students in the higher percentile in terms of income with a lower percentile in terms of income, the most unfavored student has four times more possibilities to repeat the academic year. And that affects how students see themselves and how they perceive their performance as students. A student that needs to repeat an academic year or who has repeated different academic years starts perceiving him or herself as unable. And this is an inner experience they just internalize. And it's very difficult to change a person's self-vision. In my case, working with students that have not only repeated, but also students that have backgrounds, the ones described by Gemma, well, their decisions are united, are linked to thinking whether maybe I will do the baccalaureate and then postpone my access to the labor market, or, well, I have repeated twice an academic year, maybe I should just start working. and I will work with my father who has a construction company, and therefore it's very easy to access that choice. I mean, here we have a combination of the environmental expectations from the families themselves and the students themselves, and the risk of studying and not to pass the year, but to repeat again and to waste further time. Well, that makes it very difficult to keep on believing in yourself, to be able to access higher education or to keep on studying or access university or higher education. Fine. Okay, now that you have all actually spoken, please interrupt each other whenever you want. This should be a dynamic discussion, okay? So you do not need to wait for me to give you the floor, okay? Well, I mean, this is not really a discussion, but maybe you can just contribute to to your panel colleagues' presentation. So let's go now to point number 2. Let's keep on making headway with regards to inequalities. And in this case, which groups could have greater problems in accessing higher education? Are there inequalities that are dependent on social class or gender? The combination of exclusion factors, which Jorge has already mentioned, and which indicators do we have to illustrate this inequality, which has been its evolution in the last few years? So, Elena, if you want, you can start. Oh, thank you. Well, I have made a compilation of the research work we have carried out, not only in our own research group, but also in other groups. And I'm going to talk about the Catalonian data with which we have worked and all of the proof from other studies. I'm convinced that the results, the outcomes are very similar. Let's see. I'm going to start with a social background. The social background, we have developed it and worked it out based on the parents' study level. Not because it's the best indicator, but it's an indicator that gives us, it's the most reliable factor in terms of as an indicator. Okay, from the point of view of indicators, we do whatever we can. We use the indicators that are available and that allow us to work with greater reliability. So based on this, I believe that there are some data that are quite symptomatic about what's happening. To see the probability of reaching the university depending on your parents' study level. Nowadays, what we have is that we have an almost 90% rate of accessing university of students whose parents have university studies. That means that if your mother or father have been to university and you do not go to university, you are an abnormality in your family. I mean, that is applicable if you have at least one parent with university studies. Now, the young population that has parents with high school diplomas, the rate goes down 40%. 40% of these young people are the ones who access university. And if we now go to the population that has parents with just compulsory studies, we almost have a 30%, okay? So the differences are quite large. It is clear that the differences are very large and they're probably in terms of the probability of accessing the university. And these differences are permanent in time. We have studied this throughout the years 2000 and 2010, and they are permanent throughout this period of time. And there is another effect. Not only there are differences in accessing the university, but also the type of studies are chosen once you reach university. Because linking up with the risk-taking factor I mentioned beforehand, there's a big difference in the choice made. We see that students with a lower social background, they tend to choose they tend not to choose careers that are hard to complete. We define careers that are hard to complete like the longer careers, and therefore it is more difficult to finish them. The ones that have lower performance rates and have difficult double degrees, English language degrees, all of these degrees show a very low rate of low social background. So, in addition to this, what do we know about other social and demographic characteristics of the students? Well, this has been known for a number of decades. Women access with a greater rate the university, but we know that they are a minority in technical studies, and there is an enormous imbalance between the different type of studies. We have also seen that, for example, people aged above 25, they got a big blow with the Bologna reform, basically due to the fact that in-person presence became much more demanding, and also continuous evaluation, and also the increase in prices. For lower income social backgrounds, it was not noticeable, but for people aged above 25, there was a big drop. And also students with foreign parents. There is a very small rate, but it's going up very slowly. This is what we're noticing. Let me add something else, if you give me a bit more time. With regards to the evolution, I'd like to highlight one thing, i.e. to link up accessing the university with other potential choices, especially in public universities. The first thing is that starting in 2014, private universities have increased very much, and there is a new diversification in terms of where are the different social classes heading to. We're seeing that. But there is also the issue of higher degree vocational training, which is, it's not a university degree, but it is higher education as well. And something else we have seen is that starting already in 2006, we have seen an increase in accessing higher vocational training, but it skyrockets in 2010. In 2010, it really grows significantly. And in fact, it coincides. I'm not talking about a cause-effect relationship, but it coincides with the fact that institutional changes have made vocational training from vocational training, it's more feasible to access university. And this is a way we see it is possible that it is being followed by people coming from lower social backgrounds as a sure way to accessing university, having first a vocational training degree. Sorry, Elena. But in our daily life, we see that beyond the data, we see the students. When we know where they come from, we're realizing, we're seeing this. They come from vocational training degrees. And people are, lower income students, because in qualitative studies, we have realized that middle-class students who want to access higher education, vocational training degrees need to convince their families for years on end that please allow me to actually have a higher education vocational training degree. And one of the excuses, one of the arguments they use to convince their families that afterwards I can go to university from there. So there is an increasing number of people who are following that path. Well, I've also known the opposite way, i.e. to have a university degree and as a way to become specialized, to register afterwards in a higher level vocational training course. And, well, a student who follows marine biology or something much more specialized. We also see the opposite direction trend. Going back to vocational training from a university degree. Yes, in fact, recently I was analyzing some data. at the Department of Universities in Catalonia, they calculated the numbers, and it's about 3% of the students. What happens is that it is unfinished. I do not know how many finish and then they leave. These are apparent dropouts, but they were not dropout cases from the whole university, the whole system, but from the university system alone. Okay, Jorge, maybe you could approach now. And then Elga. How would the economic cycle affect accessing higher education and the situation in other countries in the EU? Fine, well, okay. The economic cycle has an immediate effect on accessing higher education. During economic phases of the cycle in which there is a lot of youth unemployment because there isn't enough growth, during economic crisis, students keep on studying. Well, because they haven't got a chance to access the labor market. And yet, during good economic phases of the cycle with greater growth and less unemployment, a lower unemployment, youth unemployment rate, some students are tempted to leave the education system, to drop out, and to access the labor market. So this association, both theoretical and empirically, is quite clear. Now, let me introduce a small nuance on all of this. First, some data about what has happened more recently. For example, a very differentiated phase in the cycle is spent between 2008 and 2014. The first years of the crisis between 2008 and 2013 and 14. In 2014, jobs are newly created, and another phase between 2014 and 2019, in which there is a slow growth. What came after 2019, I do not even need to mention. So two very different phases. One with a crisis and another one with growth, even if actually weak growth. During the first phase between 2008 and 2013, what Helena mentioned, the group of people who access university, it skyrocketed in Spain from 75 to 45%, which is unheard of. Between 35 in 2008 and 45 in 2014. It's a bit different for men and for women. Women start out from 40 and they reach 50%. Half of all women in 2014 reach university. But for men, it goes from 30% in 2008 to 40% as well, 10 percentage points in 2014. So 10 base points both for men and for women. But women are 10 base points above men. This seems clear. But what is very interesting, and I was verifying this with some data these days, is what happens with a specific group of students. I'm referring to a group that's very well defined by the surveys of the Eurostat surveys, which are young people who are under the risk of social exclusion or poverty. This is well defined with a number of economic and material resource variables. It is a very good way of identifying people or families with problems. Well, in Spain, for the whole population at large, we lose 10 percentage points between 2008 and 2014. 10 percentage point in terms of growth. So what happens to this group in a risk situation? They start out from 25%, much lower, and they do not go up. It goes down to 24%. Why? Well, because the issue of coming into the labor market affects them, but at the same time, other factors affect them. Issues related to their economic or financial muscle to face the risks that Elena mentioned. For people who are excluded, between inverted commas, the fact that there is an economic crisis does not affect them positively with regards to accessing university. After the crisis, we have a few years between 2014 and 2019. There's a sudden economic growth with the creation of jobs. And what happens with this group who are under the risk of social exclusion and poverty? Well, during these years, they grow a lot, from 24%, which was the rate in 2014, to 32%, 8 percentage points. Whereas all students only grow between 45 and 47%. Therefore, it is true for the whole population that there isn't a significant increase in terms of enrollment during this period, but it is good. This period is good for students who are under the risk of poverty and social exclusion. I also have here some data from other countries. Should I do that or should I leave it for later? Well, maybe, carry on. I've mentioned that this access rate in Spain is of 47%. And this is a good access rate compared to other European countries. The EU's average is 37%. There are some factors, some specific factors. We are measuring access for a young segment of the population. In other countries, people access university later. There is also the accessing of adults, and maybe the effect is not as significant with a larger age group. But in that age group, there is a sudden difference, 47% in Spain. France, 46%, Germany, 34%, counting vocational training as well. Italy, 38, 48, Portugal, 42, Austria, 31. Therefore, Spain, from that point of view, is relatively well positioned. But, once again, there is another but. What happens with this population in a risk situation? In Spain, their situation is particularly difficult. To be in this risk of social exclusion, it reduces very much the possibilities to access university in Spain. Specifically, the gap between the whole population and this risk population is 15 percentage points, whereas for all of the EU, this gap, which is a disadvantage for young people in a social exclusion risk, is just 3 percentage points, okay? Between 15 base points and 3 base points in terms of a gap, there's a big difference, which is giving us a lot of information about Spain. Would you like to add something? Yes, I'd like to mention the case of the USA. Although the system to access university in the States is very different from what we have here, because it requires an application to different universities. And not only through an examination, but you have to make a full application with papers, recommendation letters. All of the access process to university is very different between Europe and the States. But it's also interesting to see the differences, to understand what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. Accessing university in the States started in the 60s. And in fact, between the 60s all the way to the 80s, it was one of the reasons why there was less inequality from a salary point of view. People access university. And yet, at the end of the 20s, that difference in this salary difference, there are less people who are protected but access it. And this is the reason why there is a sudden inequality. But accessing university is experienced as a way, is understood as a way of going up the ladder in the States. Beyond the application's difference, the application system difference, there is also a difference in accessing, but also in completing your studies, which is what's important. In the States, we have a lot of cases in which you access university, but you do not finish your studies, with the financial cost that implies, which is higher than here. So, for example, in the States, there are many, many differences in terms of race or ethnic group belonging. For example, whereas a 36% of Black American students actually access university, only 36% graduate. And we see this enormous difference, which is not to be found in other ethnic groups. And amongst Latinos, 40% start university, but only 35% graduate. So there is a gap between starting university and finishing your studies, especially in cases of populations that have been traditionally less favored. And why is this important in the American context? Because universities are very expensive. Tuition is very expensive. Tuition is higher than here. And even though there is financial aid, a lot of students end up asking for loans to be able to face their tuitions. Which, of course, I mean, there's a group of public universities which is more accessible, but the prices are still higher. And this involves an enormous amount of debt amongst students, which is very worrisome. This is one of the conversation topics in the States and potential solutions, because it's very much, it's very worrisome. And this makes many university students run the risk of falling into poverty. And they end up not having a place to live in. And this is not the case in Europe. And basically, I wanted to highlight this. The level of difficulty to access university and the financial costs involved in the States is really tragic. And it is a problem. And of course, inequalities widen. Thank you. Okay, would anyone like to add anything about the second block? Okay, we're following rigorously the timing. So, congratulations. I haven't had to cut you short. I have not had to punish anybody. Okay, the third block is about the mechanisms. All of these indicators, all of these inequality indicators we have analyzed. What mechanisms exist to improve inclusion and accessing higher education? And are there any other democratization mechanisms for that access? And are these systems efficient to reduce inequality? How have the scholarship system improved? Who would like to start? Jorge, go ahead. Well, now, the changes we have seen in the last few decades with regards to accessing higher education in many countries, I mean, every country has a different drive. But let me give you an autobiographical note. I started teaching at the university in 1990. And the sort of students I had at the University of Barcelona were higher class students, middle to higher class students. The typical student was a middle to higher class student. 32 years later, things have changed very much. Access has improved. Democratization is effective. And then, in terms of professional exit ways, I mean, one degree allows a better professional career than others. But there has been a democratization, an effective democratization, and there is a complete study that tells us that covers all factors simultaneously. It is clear that, for example, the geographic location, the development and proliferation of centers has helped. The fact that there is an educational center nearby your place, it reduces the costs of having to live far from home. That has been a case in Spain. It reduces costs. Short studies have also favored access. The so-called 3-year degrees. And substituting this by 4-year degrees has changed things. But I believe the first push forward was given by these 3-year degrees, which had a very specific demand in terms of the social background. What you have also mentioned, Elena, about the link with vocational training, very, very important. In the last few years, well, we have seen how in certain degrees there has been a reservation made for vocational training students, which eases the access to this sort of students. In general, we have a long way to go. We have a long, long way to go, for example, with regards to elder students and the adult population, which has been left out. It is also true, and this is an autobiographical note as well. In the 90s, there was always, in the afternoon, there were always adults in class, quite a number of them. And this year, I just had 1 or 2 maximum. Because if you're an adult, you just cannot afford. I mean, maybe you can take a course or a subject matter, but you cannot follow the same pace demanded by in-person presence, etc. So that should be reviewed. And then finally, not to use more time, the visibility and reduced costs. Not the fact that the cost is reduced, but the fact that the cost is perceived as being reduced. And this is channeled very well through the so-called registration costs. In 2012-2013, when you just had registration, you had an increase in registration costs, there was a certain expulsion because people stopped perceiving that as being cheap. It went to another dimension, and families had to think it twice. It's not automatic, especially in risk situations. Of course, it is different to channel the visibility through the tuition costs as opposed to analyzing it through the perspective of scholarships. Because the registration cost is there, and it is there. And for the 4 years that the career lasts, that will be the cost. Now, scholarships, well, they are contingent, so to speak. You may have it or you may lose it, depending on your academic performance, because it will be dependent on whether, when it has been included in the budget, you may be left out of the list. So a clear visibility that there is a reduced cost has helped very much to the continuity in the studies of the families with low resources. Okay, Elena, what are the fields for improvement in terms of inequalities? Well, right, let's see. My answer will be the following one. It is true that the visibility comes later, and I think it's important that before choosing, we should know what happens inside the university, because at the end of the day, deciding whether to go or not to university will depend on what people foresee that will happen there. So all of this visibility is important. But beforehand, I'd like to highlight the fact that when it comes to weighing the risk that students may face when they go to university, they're real risks. These are things that happen. So from that point of view, any policy that's addressed to reducing that risk, to reducing it effectively, I believe is a very good policy to encourage students to dare going to university and facing a reduced risk. For example, when I talked about complementary studies, and when you have an academic failure, I mean, any aid, any coaching, any accompaniment to students, for example, any coaching with regards to change. In fact, now we have a research project called complex pathways within the university, with the idea that a student can actually enter and then change and build up his own pathway, stopping, restarting again, or changing his or her studies orientations because maybe he doesn't like it, or maybe he wants to start doing something that's different from what he or she had originally thought. But to build up this complex pathway is also an added risk, a risk that you add to the possibility of finishing or not finishing. So these complex pathways is something that we're starting to study in some universities. And we believe this could be a support, an aid to actually have a happy ending, to start university and to end university with a diploma. It doesn't need to be a diploma in the degree that the person originally enrolled in. Maybe that's a priority for the same diploma. I mean, the degrees or faculties, I mean, their main goal is to retain students. You enroll with me and you will stay with me because that's why I exist. But that's not the student's perspective. Students enroll in one place and they have no commitment with that faculty. He or she may have a commitment with his own degree, with his own academic career, and what he or she wants to do. So to build up a career within the university environment is a good idea. And then if we improve the well-being of students and we achieve that they end their studies and have a good experience, it's very important that people who need to decide going to university or not, they realize that universities are places where students are welcome and they are helped out to build up their own future. Right, I'd like to add something. We're talking about two very significant topics here: accessing universities and then ending or finishing your studies. I mean, it's not just enough to access the university, but you need to finish your studies. Beyond financial aid and beyond the coaching that Elena mentioned, I've been thinking about accessing and the work that can be carried out in the different university centers and linking up with what I said beforehand about expectations. What are the expectations that we define? And how the different professors can link up with the families and with the students, what sort of pathways they want to follow, and whether their decisions are made based on fear of certain risks as opposed to what they want to do. I mean, that needs to be worked out as well. We need to work out the expectations. And once at university, especially for students coming under complex conditions who have financial problems, for example, and who come, as Elena has said, I mean, for most students whose parents have university degrees, you know, that's one point, but that's not the case for people with lower backgrounds. In these cases, you can have a problem. The problem of feeling that you do not belong to that environment. I mean, you may not understand certain rules, certain socialization rules. I mean, you may not understand how it works to be able to talk to a professor or asking the professor to devote time to you and to know that exams come at the end of the semester and that you need to understand that you need to work it out or a reading list. Maybe people haven't got this cultural capital because his or her parents have never had that experience. Well, then the university needs to have policies to coach this sort of students by having mentorship programs with already graduate students, or maybe a way of finding out who these students are. Students who come from an ACP who have a different way of looking at things, to quantify this group. Now, with the acceleration brought about by COVID, I'm sure that, well, we could have some sort of a mentorship or tutorship coaching, and to identify what are the university mechanisms which, for somebody who has always experienced that and where the educational choices are clear, but for somebody for whom it is a first family member, he or she is the first family member who goes to university, it may be costly and difficult to the point of maybe dropping out, because the person may end up feeling that he or she cannot follow that pathway, or he doesn't know how to go about it. Of the current scholarship model in Spain, the income thresholds have been changed. And in the past, the last report of the Ombudsman, the income threshold has been very much changed to access a scholarship, because the debate here is whether a scholarship is a right or not. What do you think about that? What do you think about our current Spanish scholarship model? Well, yes, I can answer myself. I believe that it is good. The good way of going about this is to dissociate academic excellence from financial need. A scholarship is given for financial needs, and you are not requiring academic excellence there. This, with regards to the public scholarship program. Other private scholarship programs have to apply different factors. But in the public system, I believe that due to the design of it and due to the target population, you help that target population to study, not because we're giving them a favor, but because that person is making a favor to us. Because that person will generate a number of positive externalities throughout his or her life. So the point is not to impose hurdles. No, you should not filter that person out because he got a 6.5 mark. So what is necessary to be a scholarship holder? Well, just your identity card. To be a student and to comply with the rules as a student, not in terms of reaching a level of excellence. I believe that is unjustifiable. At any rate, I have participated in a couple of scholarship system assessment studies, one carried out in 2008, 2009, and 2010, and another one which was a bit more crafted because it was a PhD dissertation. And it is a bit more recent. It was carried out in 2012. And those studies point out to the fact that the scholarship system is efficient in the sense that it allows students to make headway. Now, it is also true that the amount of resources that are spent on scholarships is so large that it should be much better analyzed, broken down and analyzed. To find out what's the impact, what's the real impact. And here I speak as an economist. What do you want to achieve with this? Do you want to have graduates? Okay, so let's analyze how many of them graduate. If they have a scholarship or if they do not have a scholarship. It's a complex system. And then one last point. I'm not sure it fits in here or not. The best scholarship systems I've seen in terms of design are not only higher education scholarship systems. They are scholarship systems that start in high school. In terms of the visibility I mentioned, I mean, a student who in the post-compulsory high school years has a scholarship, he will continue with his academic studies in a normal way. And this continuity is very important. I remember. I mean, to me, the best scholarship system in terms of an innovative design, it's a challenge that became the system in the UK. When it was being developed, it was substituted by a credit-based system. So it's very difficult to know how it went, how it scored. But it was designed as a continuity between a high school scholarship and a coaching and then accessing university. Would you like to add anything to what has been said so far? Any comment about this? Yes, well, let me just say one thing. I fully agree with what you have said. There is a study carried out in the States that shows that financial aid does indeed help finishing university. And I would highlight the fact that not only financial aid, but also graduation. I mean, what other mechanisms should be part of the system, given that we're using so many financial resources for these financial resources to achieve the goals that we want them to achieve? We are being so punctual. Okay, so we have covered the 3 blocks and we have shared a number of ideas. So before giving the floor to the in-person audience and the streaming audience, we have said that inequality, let me summarize, inequalities start early and interventions should also start early. They're cumulative and there are different crossroads that make this pathway much more dangerous. And financial inequalities are not the most significant ones, as has been said here, and they affect very much a person's life, including a person's health. And inequalities during key transitions when it comes to choosing, a change of phase in your studies, they are very much affected by the social background of the people who have to make those decisions. And choosing in these cases involve not only an academic risk, but all sorts of risks. And we have analyzed inequality within an individual and family context, but also within the context of schools, neighborhoods, and cities, and the rural areas, which also influence, of course. And how, with the indicators we have the indicators. We haven't got a lot of them in general. And our education policy indicators are quite recent. In Spain, with the PISA model, we have more indicators. We've seen how 90% of children of university degree parents also study at university. And these ratios go down significantly when parents do not have a university degree. And we have seen how choosing your studies implies difficulties, especially when it comes to finishing those studies, especially amongst disadvantaged background students. And then we have seen how in 2012 there was an increase in the registration prices and the balloon that affected students, and the balloon process also affected older students. And the arrival of private universities and also, we have seen how economic cycles have influenced and the different crises that we have had in Spain between 2008 and 2014, and since 2014. and how this has affected people who are under the risk of social exclusion and poverty. We have also analyzed the case of the USA, where only 30% of Black Americans end their studies, and then also short studies that was mentioned during the third round, and the importance of university coaching for complex cases, and also, well, tailor-made studies can end up the curriculum in a personalized way. And then we have analyzed the situation of the scholarship structure in Spain. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor now to the audience. Have you got any questions? Now it's the time to ask for any clarifications or any questions you may have. So go ahead, please. And our streaming audience, these are the people who are following us. The people who are following this roundtable discussion, this panel discussion through streaming, you may also ask your questions through the chat box. For example, Eva asks via streaming. She teaches in a high school, and she asks which are the good actions carried out in high schools to actually reduce the gap. Who would like to answer? Well, go ahead. Elena mentioned it, but I believe that one of the keys to try and reduce these inequalities is the role played by the school beyond its academic role. I mean, to coach the student, to get to know in depth the student. In my own experience, in the school where I used to work, the role of the tutor was crucial. The tutor, I mean, it was all very well structured to be able to get to know in depth the students, not only their performance in the classroom, but also to understand which were their family circumstances, what were the facilities they had to study, whether they had to take care of their younger brothers, and that sort of thing. To understand the context in which students try to progress academically. This is very important. And specifically, and this is my personal case, but the way the school was structured allowed for the tutors' coaching to be continuous and immediate, because the distribution of spaces for different subject matters was different. I mean, we worked in different fields with 3 professors in the classroom, and this allowed one of the tutors, who was in the social and linguistic field and the other one in the scientific and technological field, and amongst all of the 3 professors, they covered 90% of the lective hours of students. So there was always a tutor nearby. This is an example. I mean, to be creative in seeing how this socio-emotional contact can occur, to be close to the student, and how it can be carried out, how the academic coaching can be carried out. Would you like to add anything? Well, I would add one thing. It is also good that there are initiative actions undertaken by the universities, i.e. that the universities should get close to the high schools, especially to certain high schools, where it is specifically difficult to make a decision to go to university, and even if you have a high school diploma, and therefore they could actually do that transition. And this type of initiative actions by the universities, I believe it is not well assessed yet, because some of them are pilots, or they are targeting few students. From a qualitative point of view, when you talk to the people who do this, they get to know the field and they get to know in depth the problems faced by students, and they understand how to coach this transition for the future of the students. Would the audiences, both in person and on streaming, have any questions? Okay, we have another question here on streaming. Okay, you'll wait for the roving mic, please. What could you tell us about the changes in the education law, the so-called LOCSE? Do you have an opinion or any comments to make about that? Well, this is so recent, I don't know if you have had a chance to assess it. Well, from our point of view, no. We haven't had a chance to study that, no. Fine, well, thank you anyway for your question. Oh, you have another question, okay. There is a historical disconnection between profession, work, and university. Because in spite of the fact that there are more education and study choices, young people go to university with the fear that they do not know where they will end up working and what sort of professional opportunities your studies will bring about. Jorge, go ahead. Well, this is a very interesting question. Well, we're talking about two totally different institutions with great difficulty to link up. Their paces are absolutely different. The labor market currently is going through changes that are so significant. In 5 years' time, automation has affected so much the organization of work. And for a job, I mean, a job nowadays has nothing to do with what it used to be 20 years ago. And university syllabuses, the most recent ones are 15-year-old. And the university's pace is very slow. And the university has an intrinsic problem. It has been designed to reproduce knowledge, not to adapt to a knowledge or to ever-evolving needs or to non-cognitive, ever-changing skills. No, the university reproduces ever since the Middle Ages. It is reproducing knowledge. To reproduce knowledge as an end in itself, and to reproduce social differences as well. If you think of using the university to reduce inequalities, when in fact it's an institution that has been created to perpetuate these differences. So the efforts that are made are, of course, encouraging, and they should be applauded, but they are very difficult. In a university context, there are many difficulties that are quite basic when it comes to giving continuity to teaching and research. The efforts made to link up the university with the labor market in some careers is not a priority, unfortunately. I mean, it is not a priority for the institution. Well, I'd like to make a distinction between what is the adaptation of the syllabus to the needs of the labor market and the perception that students have about how it is adapted or not adapted. Sometimes I do not agree fully with what Jorge has said, because I believe there are many differences between different types of studies. Some studies are very much adapted to the immediate needs of the labor market. Others are more basic. Others, it looks like they're adapting quickly, but in fact, they're adapting to research, and it's not clear that state-of-the-art research links up what's needed in the labor market. So it depends on the type of studies. But regardless of what happens, students always have the feeling that they are not sufficiently prepared to go to the labor market. So I believe that from that point of view, something that has been very good for our syllabuses is to include practices and to even include final dissertations to get your degree. I've noticed a big change ever since this was introduced with regards to how students end, how they used to finish and how they finish now. Somehow this allows them to feel a bit more secure about what they know how to do. I remember that in the past, a sociology student, or even a pedagogy student would go to the labor market saying, well, I do not know what I know how to do. I cannot even sell myself. I cannot sell my skills because I do not know which skills I have. But those students who taught teaching, who learned teaching, who have been making a lot of practices, they knew what they knew how to do. They knew how to sell their skills. So there is also an awareness-raising part of the student of what is a professional skill, how to apply it, and how to apply it so that he or she understands what he or she has been doing during all of his or her training years. And I'm going to be even more nostalgic now. My dissertation was about the change of syllabuses in computing science degrees. At the time, I studied different universities, and I studied and analyzed how these new syllabuses had been made. And I remember talking to teachers who used to tell me, well, of course, there are constantly new programming computer languages, but we do not do that because once our student goes to the labor market, he or she will be obsolete. We have to teach them basic principles of programming computer languages. Of course, that's more abstract, more difficult. And when they go to the labor market, they need to learn the computer science language that's used in companies. That's the way we have to protect them as future graduates, and not to just defend what the labor market needs at some specific point. And I remember that clearly, because business interests do not need to be the university's interests. They are different interests, as Jorge said. They have different rationales, different bases, and they need to think differently. We play a different role in society. Well, the student always demands an immediate link between what he or she has studied and what the labor market and the business world will demand from him. Well, yes, linking up with what you have just said, there is a study that has been recently published by Howard Gardner, who is this Harvard professor who talks about multiple intelligence. Before the pandemic, it was published. A study made in different universities. In the USA, the model is a bit different in the sense that you do not study a career specifically at the beginning, but it's a bit wider. And I interviewed quite a few thousand students. He interviewed students, and he realized that there are different student profiles. One of them is the one that goes to university to get ready for the labor market in a very transactional way. Okay, I'm going to university to get ready for the labor market. But there are other profiles who want, they want to learn about what you want to do, what interests you. And I remembered this when you asked this question. Some of them want to connect with the labor market. And maybe that's not the role to be played by the university, or even what students may be looking for. We are also asked, and this is one of the last questions, when the resources and the context are different, if you want to go ahead, how can we help? That has been already answered, hasn't it? Would you like to add anything to that question? Well, when the context is disadvantaged, we need to somehow convey the idea of an investment. I mean, the equation would be an investment, not in a strict financial sense, but to exchange present for the future, to invest the present, to access things, to give up resources in the present to have other things in the future, to have other possibilities in the future. So anything that's done to promote the idea that you're exchanging the present for the future, you are somehow trading off the present for the future, and that's very positive. I mean, for example, today we have a gorgeous, brilliant spring afternoon. What are you doing here in this dark room? Well, we are somehow trading off this event, and you're listening to me, to learn for the future. I mean, to exchange the present for the future is better done when you see the future, when it is possible to visualize the future, and when the future shows a lower risk. And here we have the idea of a lower risk. In other words, to make a future be seen that shows lower risks, that's a future that's visible and clear, and also with lower costs. Basically, that's how we square the circle. But there are means to attain that. Would you like to introduce any other variables to what has already been said? Any further questions? Yes, I'd like to ask you a question. I'd like to know, what's the role played by the current system to assign students in the public school system with regards to inequalities or equality at school, not at university? Yes, at school, yeah, in public schools. Would you like to say anything about that? Well, the problem of segregation is a serious problem. We have it, and it's well known, and it's being worked out. But of course, I mean, this would give rise to another conference. We know it has many root causes. The root causes are hard to tackle because it's a market, and like any other market, it plays with the brand of the school and also with who goes to that school and the preferences of families as to who will be the companions or the classmates of their sons and daughters. It's highly complex. And the consequences are also very serious. Eva mentioned them beforehand. How does your peer group play? In general, when it comes to valuing education, to conceiving education as something valuable, not only from the point of view of the families. I mean, son, you have to study. Daughter, you have to study. But also, who are your peers? Who will be your classmates? I mean, you're a good student or you're a failure. You're a loser or you're a winner. I mean, the two visions imply what it means to be a good student. And this is especially important in adolescence. What peers do during your teenage years have a great influence on the power of education for our children, and for the future even more so. So, unfortunately, it's a big, serious problem from the point of view of the root causes, which makes it very difficult to solve, and with the very serious consequences it has from the point of view of the educational equality aim. If we imagine a school, talking about school segregation, in a center where there is a greater dropout rate, and many of your classmates decide to drop out, that becomes a more feasible option as opposed to a school in which nobody drops out. Or the time it comes to decide, I mean, whether to keep on studying or not, depending on what prevails in your environment. In some contexts, in some social contexts, it is unthinkable to drop out, whereas in other contexts, it is actually the standard. May I add something, please? I don't know what happens to me today, but I keep on remembering my research work. research work we have carried out in the past. I wanted to talk about the case study of a boy from a very, very poor neighborhood in who was doing telecommunications engineering. He was doing his 4th year and he had honors. I mean, his case study was very impacting to me because he told me how he had gone to high school with very good marks. He was a very, very intelligent boy. And he said nobody studied. He followed what his classmates did. He did vocational training, and from vocational training, he did a higher vocational training degree, and then he went to university and he did telecommunications. And I found out from one of his teachers that he did a PhD and now he's a professor. He's a university professor. So then you say, well, he started with vocational training, fine, but he was doomed to being a school dropout and a school failure. So the environment is what marks you. The fact that he did this pathway, that he followed this pathway, which is terrible. It's a pity. In fact, that comes from a city segregation already, not only school segregation. It's a pity this happens. But on the other hand, I also think that, for example, we must value the connection of the education system and how vocational training and the academic pathways are interconnected, how they're intertwined. And this is the best system we can have. We have a highly intertwined, a highly interconnected system. And this is crucial because it is true that it also generates inequalities in the sense that there are people with a lower social background who feel they do not have an academic choice. They go straight to the labor market. It is true that this generates school segregation. When I say segregation, I mean segregation between the labor pathway and the academic pathway. But somehow it gives you a buffer that helps at least part of them, and the others can always go back to it. So it is it's a system that's a bit more diversified and a bit more interconnected, and it's a more equitable system. Although on the way it can create some disadjustments. That's my idea about the system we have. Fine. So time is up. Thank you very much indeed to all of you, to all panel members. And I'd like to thank the whole audience for your participation. Thank you to all of the people who have been following us via streaming. I'd like to thank the La Caixa Foundation for having organized this event, and let's call it a day. Thank you very much indeed.